The room went quiet the second I stepped through those doors. Not the respectful kind of quiet. Not the kind that falls over a room when someone important arrives. The other kind. The kind that moves through a crowd like a current, person to person, until it curls into something uglier. And then the laughter started. I heard it building in waves from the far end of the room toward me, saw hands rising to cover mouths, eyes cutting sideways, champagne flutes lifted just high enough to hide smirks. And then a woman near the bar, someone I had never seen before in my life, someone wearing a dress that probably cost as much as a car payment, leaned into the man beside her and said it just loud enough for me to hear clearly over the string quartet playing in the corner. "Oh my God, is that him? The man who can't keep his wife's attention for 5 minutes?" I kept walking. My face didn't move. My breathing stayed even. 23 years of running a company teaches you to absorb a hit without flinching. You learn that the worst thing you can do when someone is trying to break you in public is let them see it working. But I heard every word. Every single one. Honestly, I have to stop here for just a second before we go any further, because when I first heard this story, I had to put my phone down and walk around my apartment for a few minutes. Because there's humiliation, and then there's this. Being laughed at in a room full of people who were there because of money you made. I need you to understand what that actually means before we go deeper. Because this story is not what you think it is. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 51 years old. I built a cold chain logistics and freight distribution company from a single rented loading dock in East Point, Georgia, into a regional operation covering 8 states, with a valuation that crossed $160 million 3 years ago. I hold 68% ownership. My wife, Denise, holds the other 32. Or she did. That Saturday night at the grand opening of Denise's new Nashville branch, an event held on the 31st floor of a glass tower off Broadway, attended by 350 people who were currently laughing at me, I made a decision. Not an emotional one. Not a reactive one. The kind of decision you can only make when the anger has already gone so deep that it's found its floor and gone quiet. I turned around and walked back to the elevator, calmly, without a word, and then I went to work. Before I tell you what came next, I need to go back. Not because I want your sympathy. I want you to understand exactly how we got to that room. Denise Harmon, her name before she became Denise Webb, was 28 when I met her. I was 33. She was the regional accounts director for a mid-size refrigerated freight broker based out of Charlotte, and I was there pitching them on a cold chain partnership for my then 4-year-old company. She walked me to the conference room, and when I laid out my presentation, she was the only person in that room who pushed back in a way that made me pause. She looked at me across the table and said, "What happens to your clients when you scale your capacity faster than your quality controls can follow? Have you modeled the failure points?" I looked at her and thought, this woman is sharp in a way that most people in this room are not. We had dinner 3 nights later. We were engaged 16 months after that. 2 years into our marriage, I did something that defined everything that came after. I gave Denise 32% equity in Web Cold Chain Solutions. Not because I was legally obligated to. Not because she pushed for it. Because I believed in her. Because in those 2 years she had already rebuilt our client relationships division from a disorganized mess into something that genuinely worked. Because I thought we were partners in every sense of the word. Because I am, when I love someone, the kind of man who goes completely all in. Remember that. It becomes important later. For the first 9 years, the partnership was real. Denise was genuinely gifted at the side of the business. I struggled with the social architecture of it, the rooms full of people deciding whether to trust you, the long dinners with regional distributors where the real decisions get made over dessert. Where I was most comfortable in operations and numbers, she was most comfortable in people. We told ourselves we were complementary. I believed that story. What I didn't see because I was too focused on the company was when the story started changing. It started about 3 years ago. Small things at first, the kind of small things that don't look like anything until you're already looking at everything. Denise began pushing for the Nashville expansion, with an urgency that felt different from her usual strategic thinking. Not just advocating for it, driving it, almost impatient about it, like she'd already decided the answer and the conversation was a formality. I supported it. Of course I did. I backed her proposal with $28 million in company capital, and told her I trusted her judgment. Then came the late nights. Then came the calls that stopped when I walked into the room. The weekends she spent in Nashville during the build-out, while I held the Columbus operations together. The way she began mentioning her project director on the Nashville job, a man named Calvin Price, with a practiced casualness, like she'd rehearsed how to say his name without emphasis. I'm not a suspicious person by nature, but I am an analytical one. I noticed. I filed it away, and I kept working. 6 months before the grand opening, I commissioned a routine financial review of the Nashville branch's accounting structure. I did this with every major project. It was standard practice, nothing personal, nothing targeted. But this review came back with something that was not standard at all. 2 sets of books. Not careless, obvious fraud, not the kind of thing someone panicked leaves behind. Sophisticated, layered adjustments designed to look like normal variance when you glanced at the macro picture. But when you followed the vendor payments through 3 shell entities that had no legitimate business reason to exist, the pattern became clear. Money was moving not in dramatic amounts, but consistently, over 17 months. Approximately $3.9 million had been quietly redirected out of the Nashville build-out budget. The paper trail, faint as it was, pointed toward 2 names. One was Calvin Price. The other was my wife. I sat with that for 10 days before I did anything. 10 days of going home to Denise. 10 days of eating dinner with her. 10 days of listening to her talk about the florist getting the centerpieces wrong, and the caterer upgrading the champagne selection. 10 days of watching her look at me across the table and tell me everything except the truth. I want to be honest with you right now because I think about those 10 days more than almost anything else in this story. I have asked myself over and over whether I could have done that. Sat across from someone I loved, knowing what I knew, and just continued. Asked about her day. Passed the bread. Most of us would have broken by day 2. Most of us would have confronted, accused, demanded, and I think most of us would have been wrong too. Because what Marcus did in those 10 days wasn't coldness. It was grief that had already done its work, and left behind something more precise. I used those 10 days wisely. I called Leon Marsh, who had been my attorney for 11 years, and who I trust more than almost any person alive. I called my CFO, a methodical woman named Sandra Osei, who has the kind of mind that doesn't miss anything. And I called Raymond Cole, a forensic financial investigator I'd worked with twice before on acquisition due diligence. Together, over those 10 days, we built a case. Every transaction documented, every shell entity traced, every electronic signature time-stamped and preserved. We also found something I hadn't anticipated. Denise had quietly filed paperwork 5 months earlier to reclassify her shares buried in a routine corporate filing, the kind that crosses the founding shareholder's desk only if someone is specifically watching. She had consulted a corporate attorney about restructuring the ownership in a way that would give her operational control of the Nashville branch as a semi-independent subsidiary. If the filing had gone through unchallenged, she would have effectively created a separate entity she controlled outright built on $28 million of my capital. She wasn't planning a conversation. She was planning an exit. And then Raymond found the messages. He wasn't looking for them. He was reviewing communications logs on the company server as part of the financial investigation. And there they were. 19 months of correspondence on a company email account Denise had apparently never thought to secure. I won't describe the content in detail. What I will tell you is this. Denise shared things about me with Calvin Price. Private things, intimate things, the kind of things a wife learns about a husband across years of shared life, and is supposed to keep in confidence, she told him. And he used them to make her laugh. 19 months of laughing at me in writing. I read those messages once. I closed the file. I told Raymond to preserve everything. And then I drove to the gym and hit a heavy bag for 90 minutes because I needed to hit something that wasn't going to be used as evidence. Then I went back to planning. The grand opening party was a Saturday night. The venue was the Apex Ballroom at the Meridian Grand on Broadway in Nashville. 350 guests, a string quartet, a champagne tower, a view of the Cumberland River from the 31st floor. Denise had spared no expense, because she was spending company money. My company money. I decided to attend. Not to confront her. Not to create a scene. I decided to attend, because disappearing that night would have been suspicious, and because the sequence of events I had in motion required me to be present. What I didn't anticipate was Calvin Price. I arrived at the Meridian Grand at 7:50. The doorman checked my name against the list and something flickered across his face, something I couldn't read in the moment but understood later. He'd been told something about me. The elevator opened onto the 31st floor. The room was full and loud and lit the way Denise always lit a room, beautifully, precisely, with the kind of attention to atmosphere that was always her genuine gift. The silence started about 12 seconds after I entered. Not immediate. It spread, person to person, like a message being passed. And then came the laughter, the woman near the bar, the words that weren't quite a whisper. The room felt like it was tilting. I kept walking. My breathing stayed even. I was looking for Denise. I found her across the room, standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river, wearing a dress I'd never seen before, surrounded by people who were watching me approach with an expression I can only describe as anticipatory. Denise looked at me with something calculating in her eyes. Not panic, not guilt, not even defiance. Calculation, like she was running a sequence in her head. I was 20 feet from her when Calvin Price stepped in front of me. He was younger than me, maybe 40, wearing a suit that fit well enough to tell you it had been selected for this occasion specifically. He had the posture of a man who believed he was currently winning. As far as he knew, he was. He put a hand flat against my chest, not hard, not violent, just the way you stop someone when you want to make a point without technically starting anything. And he said, calmly, just loud enough for the nearest 20 people to hear, "Marcus, I think it might be time for you to head out. This is a private event, for partners and stakeholders, and your presence is becoming a disruption." He glanced sideways and added, "Can someone let security know we have a situation?" Denise was watching from across the room. She didn't move. She didn't say a word. She just watched. I looked down at the hand on my chest. Then I looked up at Calvin Price's face. I said, very quietly, so only he could hear, "Take your hand off me." Once. He did. Something in my voice settled the question without requiring anything further from either of us. I straightened my jacket. I looked around the room at all those faces, some still laughing, some gone quiet with something that might have been unease. I looked at Denise, who still hadn't moved. Then I walked toward the elevator. I heard scattered laughter as the doors closed behind me. By the time I reached the lobby, I had my phone in my hand. I called Leon. "It's time," I said. "Been waiting," he said. "Everything's in position." If you have ever walked out of a room where someone you loved chose not to defend you, not because they couldn't, but because they had already decided whose side they were on, then you know that the walk to the elevator is not the moment you lose. It's the moment you understand exactly how much you were already carrying alone. And once you understand that, something changes. The weight doesn't go away. But you stop being surprised by it. Here is what happens when a man with 68% majority ownership of a $160 million company decides to exercise that ownership over the course of a single night. Leon's first call was to the company's primary bank, where I held full signatory authority on all major accounts. By 8:20 that Saturday evening, every discretionary payment attached to the Nashville branch was suspended pending a formal review. The vendor invoices scheduled to auto-pay Monday morning frozen. The contractor draws frozen. The lease escalation Denise had quietly approved without my sign-off frozen. Leon's second call was to the catering company, We had a corporate account on file with them going back 5 years. The balance due on that evening's event was $380,000, which Denise had planned to process through the company account on Monday. Leon contacted them, documented the account freeze, and suggested they reach out to Denise directly about alternative payment arrangements. The third call went to the hotel block 14 rooms at the Thompson Nashville on 5th Avenue South, reserved for out-of-town guests. Corporate account, same result. Suspended. The fourth call was the one I'd been thinking about the longest. Denise and I had a business trip booked to Lisbon in 3 weeks, described to me as a European distributor summit. Raymond's investigation had already established that Calvin Price was registered for the same summit in the same hotel, under a company travel account. Business class flights. A suite at the Barrow Alto Hotel. 4 nights. Leon made the call. Both reservations canceled. By 10:15 that night, while Denise was presumably still in that ballroom 30, 1 floors above Broadway raising champagne glasses, the financial structure she'd spent 2 years quietly building had begun to come apart. But the most significant action had happened 2 days earlier before the party. I had exercised a shareholder provision Leon had drafted into our corporate agreement 4 years prior, back when the company first crossed the $75 million valuation threshold. A clause allowing the majority shareholder to initiate a formal valuation, review, and temporary asset freeze on any division or subsidiary in response to a documented financial irregularity. The irregularity was documented. The clause was triggered. The Nashville branch was now subject to a full financial review under my authority as majority shareholder. Denise's plan to spin it off as an independent entity had just hit a wall the size of a federal filing. I drove back to Atlanta that night. 4 hours on I-24 west to I-75 south, windows down, radio off. I needed the quiet. I thought about 12 years of marriage. I thought about a woman who once asked me the right question in a conference room in Charlotte, and who I had answered honestly because I thought she deserved it. I thought about what it means to go all in on a person, to give them equity, to give them trust, to give them the private architecture of yourself, and have them invest all of it in something you never agreed to. I didn't cry. Not because I'm made of stone, I'm not, but the grief had already happened somewhere in those 10 days of watching and building. What was left felt more like work. The kind of quiet, deliberate work I had been doing my entire adult life. I got home at 1:45 inches the morning, poured 1 glass of bourbon, went to bed. My phone had 6 missed calls. The first one came at 10:38. Denise. I let it go. The second 11 minutes later, Calvin's number, which I'd had for 2 years because he was a company employee. Let it go. Then Denise again. Then, a Nashville area code I didn't recognize, which turned out to be the catering company's event director, who had apparently just been informed that Monday's payment wouldn't process, and was understandably alarmed. Then Denise 4 more times. Then a number I didn't have saved that turned out to be the hotel's corporate accounts manager. 61 calls by the time I put the phone face down on my nightstand and slept for 5 hours. Sunday morning I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table Denise and I had eaten breakfast at for 8 years, and I started returning calls. Not Denise's, not Calvin's. The vendor calls, the catering company, the hotel. I handled each one professionally. I apologized for the inconvenience. I confirmed that the company's obligations would be addressed through the appropriate channels once the review was complete. I kept every conversation courteous, and I made sure every vendor left with a clear understanding. If they had questions about payment, they should contact Denise Webb directly. The doorbell rang at 12:15 Sunday afternoon. I looked through the window before opening it and saw something I hadn't anticipated at all. It was Denise's father. Thomas Harmon is 71 years old. He's a retired electrician from Greensboro, North Carolina. A man who built things with his hands for 40 years and who, in the 12 years I'd known him, had never once asked me for anything. He called me on my birthday. He came to my mother's funeral 3 years ago and stood beside me at the graveside without me having to ask. He is, in the truest sense, a decent man. And he was standing on my porch with his car keys in his hand, which meant he had driven 3 hours from Greensboro without calling ahead. I opened the door. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "I think you need to tell me what happened." I made him coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, and I told him not everything, not the messages, not the details no father should hear about his daughter, but the financial picture. The shell entities, the $3.9 million, the share restructuring filing, the plan to spin off the Nashville branch. Thomas listened without interrupting. He held his mug with both hands and stared at the table while I talked. When I finished, he didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he said, "I'm going to ask you something and I need a straight answer." "Of course," I said. "Is there any part of this that might not be what it looks like?" "No," I said. "I genuinely wish there were." He nodded slowly. "She called me last night, told me you were trying to destroy her business out of jealousy, that you showed up at the party and made a scene and then went home and canceled everything to punish her." He paused. "I didn't say anything. I told her you weren't the kind of man who made scenes." She didn't have a good answer for that. He set his mug down. "I'm sorry, Marcus. I don't know where I went wrong with her. But I know this isn't on you." I walked him to his car an hour later. He shook my hand. Then he pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than you'd expect, longer than anything either of us would have initiated under easier circumstances. I stood in the driveway after he drove away, and let myself feel the full weight of it for 60 seconds. Exactly 60. Then I went inside and called Leon. The board meeting was held in our Atlanta office on a Thursday afternoon. Denise arrived with her own attorney, a sharp woman named Victoria Clements, whose reputation I'd known for years. Denise looked composed at the surface, but something underneath that composure was moving around, not quite settled. Calvin Price was not present. His attorney was. Our two independent directors, a supply chain consultant named Margaret Foy and a logistics finance veteran named Harold James, had reviewed Raymond's documentation over 2 full days with the gravity it deserved. They voted to uphold the financial review and the temporary asset freeze. Denise's motion to have the freeze overturned failed. The board authorized a full independent audit of the Nashville branch to be completed within 60 days. All discretionary spending suspended. The share restructuring filing formally challenged and placed on hold. Victoria Clements argued the actions were retaliatory and made a compelling case she is excellent at her job. But you cannot argue persuasively with a paper trail that forensic accountants have already mapped to its source. After the meeting ended, Denise and I were alone in the hallway for about 30 seconds, while our attorneys spoke with the independent directors. It was the first time we'd been face to face since I walked out of that ballroom. She looked at me and said, "You didn't have to do this the way you did it." I said, "You chose the terms when you signed the shell company documents." She said, "I was going to talk to you." I said, "Denise, you told Calvin things about me, private things, and let him use them against me. You let 350 people hear me reduced to a punchline in a room I financed, and you stood there and watched. I don't think talking was ever part of your plan." She didn't answer. I walked back into the boardroom. Calvin Price's employment was terminated the Monday after the party. Financial misconduct, pending investigation. Corporate email revoked. Company vehicle collected Tuesday by the leasing company. He hired an attorney and sent a wrongful termination letter. Raymond's documentation went to that attorney within 48 hours. The letter was not followed up on. I heard through a contact in Nashville commercial real estate that Calvin had vacated the apartment he'd been renting in the Gulch neighborhood. I heard that Denise had been supplementing his rent through a vendor account. I heard that when that account froze, his landlord began asking uncomfortable questions. I didn't go looking for any of that information. It came to me, the way information tends to come to you when you've run a company for 20 years and you know the right people. The divorce filing arrived 38 days after the party. I expected it sooner. I think Denise and Victoria were watching the financial situation develop before committing to a position. Smart tactically. But the financial situation was not developing in Denise's favor. She filed in Fulton County, Georgia. Irreconcilable differences. The legal language for we both know exactly what happened and would prefer not to put it in a document. Her attorney made an aggressive claim on the 32% equity stake, arguing for valuation treatment that would have put her share north of $50 million. Leon had anticipated this. We'd spent 3 weeks preparing our counter. The 32% stake was real and legitimate, and I wasn't disputing its existence. But the financial misconduct, the $3.9 million, the shell entities, the breach of fiduciary duty was now formally on record. In Georgia, documented financial misconduct by a shareholder affects the conversation around dissolution. It doesn't eliminate equity, but it changes the terms significantly. It also meant Denise faced potential civil liability entirely separate from the divorce. And if the audit concluded with the findings Raymond had flagged, there was a referral to consider. Victoria Clements is smart enough to know what the audit was going to find. I believe she told Denise. I believe Denise had a hard several days. The settlement took 4 months of negotiation. The specific terms are confidential by agreement. What I will tell you is that it was fair, not generous on either side. Fair. Every number reflected what the documentation showed. The Nashville branch is now under new management. I brought in an operations director named Angela Ford, who came from a national freight operation in Dallas and who has no personal history with my ex-wife. The audit concluded. The findings were significant. 2 matters were referred out. I don't know what will happen with those referrals. That's not my case to run. 3 months after the divorce finalized, I was at my desk on a Tuesday morning reviewing third-quarter numbers when my assistant told me a woman was downstairs without an appointment, saying it was personal and that she thought I'd want to hear what she had to say. I told her to send the woman up. She was maybe 46, dressed professionally, with the kind of direct eye contact you see in people accustomed to difficult conversations. She introduced herself as Pamela Osei, no relation to Sandra, my CFO. She said she was a partner at a corporate ethics consulting firm, and that she'd become aware of what had happened with the Nashville branch through contacts in the industry who knew the audit results. She said she had been conducting a parallel investigation into Calvin Price on behalf of a previous employer. She believed she had documentation connecting him to similar financial irregularities at a logistics operation in Memphis, 2 years before he joined Web Cold Chain. She wanted to know if I'd be willing to cooperate in sharing information. I called Leon. Leon called her attorney. We had a formal meeting 2 weeks later. I don't know yet where that goes, but I'll tell you what I thought when she left my office that afternoon. I thought about a woman in a conference room in Charlotte 12 years ago, asking me what happens when you scale faster than your infrastructure can support. I gave her the best answer I had at the time. And then I spent the next 12 years learning it wasn't enough. That you can build the strongest structure in the world, and it can still fail if the person you trusted inside it is quietly pulling the load-bearing walls apart. But here's what I also know. Structures can be rebuilt. I know exactly how to do that. It's what I have always known how to do. There is one more thing I want to tell you before this ends. 4 weeks after the board meeting, I drove up to Greensboro on a Sunday and took Thomas Harmon to breakfast. He picked the place a diner on Battleground Avenue that had apparently been serving the same menu since 1983. We had eggs and strong coffee, and talked about the Panthers for 20 minutes, which is the only football team Thomas has ever cared about with any real conviction. Then he set his mug down and said, I talked to Denise. I waited until I felt like I could say it right. I told her that whatever she thought she was doing, she had treated you badly, that regardless of what happened between the two of you, a man deserved better than what she let happen at that party. He looked at his coffee, she cried, which surprised me. I asked if she said anything. She said she'd been ashamed of herself since that night, that when she watched your face as you were walking toward the elevator, something came clear to her that hadn't been clear before. I didn't say anything. I'm not asking you to forgive her, Thomas said quickly. That's your business, and it always will be. I just wanted you to know that the woman I raised is still somewhere in there. She just made a long series of very wrong choices. He looked up at me. And probably I made some too, for not asking harder questions when I should have. I told him he wasn't responsible for the choices of a 40-year-old woman. He said, "No, but I'm responsible for breakfast." He picked up the check before I could get to it. I sat in my car for a few minutes before driving back to Atlanta. The diner windows were fogged at the edges from the warmth inside. I thought about what it means to go all in on a person. About what you're supposed to do when that turns out to be the wrong call. I don't have a clean answer for that. I'm not sure anyone does. What I know is that wrong choices made by other people are not the end of your story. They are a chapter, and chapters end. I'm 51 years old. I built a company from a rented loading dock in East Point, Georgia, into something worth $160 million. I made that happen through roughly 10,000 days of showing up, doing the work, and refusing to stay down when the ground moved under me. That is still who I am. The people who get to define me fit in one hand. Thomas Harmon is one of them. Leon Marsh is another. My mother, gone 3 years now, counts, even though she's no longer here to know it. My senior logistics director, a man named Curtis Ephraim, who has worked alongside me for 13 years and who I trust without qualification. Calvin Price is not on that list. And as of 4 months ago, Denise Webb isn't either. What happened on the 31st floor of the Meridian Grand on Broadway, the laughter, the words, the hand on my chest, the security guard walking toward me like I was a disturbance to be removed from a room I had built, was meant to be the ending. Meant to be the moment I broke. It was actually the moment I started. 61 missed calls on a phone I didn't answer. That is not a man being destroyed. That is a man who already knows exactly what he's doing. If you've ever been in a room where someone looked right through you, where you became a punchline instead of a person, I want you to hear this. The quietest response is sometimes the most powerful one. Not every battle needs to be loud to be won. The most devastating thing Marcus Webb did was not the asset freeze, not the board meeting, not the forensic documentation. It was the 10 days. 10 days of choosing precision over reaction, strategy over emotion, the long game over the satisfying short one. Most of us, and I include myself completely honestly here, would not have made it past day 3. We would have confronted. We would have accused. We would have given away every advantage we had for 10 seconds of feeling righteous. And I understand that impulse. But I think there's something worth sitting with in the idea that sometimes the most powerful version of yourself is the one that waits. Here's what I want to leave you with today. This story isn't really about money, or corporate law, or even betrayal. It's about what happens when you discover that the foundation you built your life on was being quietly hollowed out, and you have to decide whether to collapse or to rebuild. Marcus rebuilt. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Deliberately, precisely, one documented transaction at a time. And the thing that strikes me most is this. He didn't do it out of spite. He did it because it was the only honest thing left to do. There is a version of this story where Marcus explodes in that ballroom, says things he can't take back, and hands every legal and moral advantage to the other side. He chose differently. That choice is worth thinking about. So, here's a question I want to leave with you today. When the floor drops out from under you, do you tend to react, or do you tend to build? There's no wrong answer, but knowing which one you are might be the most useful thing you can take from everything Marcus went through. Drop a comment and tell me 1, 2, or 3. 1 if you think Marcus handled this exactly right. 2 if you think he went too far. 3 if you honestly don't know, because honestly, that might be the most honest answer of all. And tell me where you're watching from right now, and what time it is where you are. I genuinely read through the comments, and I want to know who's out there. If you've ever been in a situation even half as complicated as this one, share it below. You don't have to share details. 1 word is enough. I read all of them. If this story made you stop and think, please make sure you're subscribed, because I have more stories coming that you genuinely don't want to miss. Stories about people who made hard choices, quiet choices, and are still here to tell you it was worth it. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences. fully rewritten and reimagined, set in Atlanta, Georgia, to create original content. Any resemblance to real people, events, or businesses is entirely coincidental.